I hate to scare people. Actually, it's 3 minutes. I always count on Kelly being here, right? Because he keeps up with us when he's gone. 2 weeks ago, he wrote me and said, "I'm watching you online as I go to the airport." You know. And then last week he said, "I'm stuck in Orlando." You didn't get to see it, did you? Wow. I could. It's still 3 minutes, but I'm getting ready. I don't need my phone, do I? Unless Kevin sends me a text. Oh. Well, the more that come in, the uglier they get. Oh, no. I'm looking back here. The guy I'm talking about's never acknowledged it. It's good to see each of you this evening. We appreciate your presence and glad to have you with us in the class. There may be some of you here for the first time, and there may be some that are been here every time, and some that still are out in the hall. So it's good to see you. We're going to be talking tonight about a different subject. We're going to talk about daily life in Bible times as it pertains to the disease as they had and the kind of medication they had and things of that sort. Some of the things that we read about in the Scripture at least. And so it's going to be about disease and death and burial. Maybe not all of that in one evening, but we'll study this again. I understand Wednesday there won't be a class. Is that correct, everybody? People who know? There's a singing. Will not be a class. Okay. So that means next Sunday night, Lord willing, we will continue with this same subject. Let's begin our class with prayer at this time. Scott, would you direct us in prayer? Yeah.
Father, we're grateful as we come together tonight to be with one like faith. We're grateful for your word and for the opportunity that we have to give a better understanding of that and greater application to our lives. We're mindful of those that are unable to be out. We pray that things that are being done are best and they will be improved and they will be back short. We're mindful of our failings and our faults, and we pray, Father, not only that we will repent of these, but you'll help us to see them and to improve in our efforts to serve you day by day. Give us when we fail.
Thank you. Actually, we're going to talk about daily disease and death in Bible times. It is appointed unto man once to, what's the word? Die. That's us too. It is appointed unto men once to die, and after that the judgment. And so we face the same things that they did, and we wonder how did they deal with it in Bible times. And this may help us just a little bit to understand. So I'm going to broaden this. It's going to be dealing with New Testament and Old Testament times together. The god Asclepius was very popular by the time New Testament Christianity came on the scene. And in fact, there are places where you can go and find a lot of information about Asclepius. He was known as the God of healing. He is always pictured with the caduceus at his side. He's always reaching down for that, and it is the pole that you see on the back of sometimes on ambulances, sometimes in connection with drugstores, and always the medical profession, and there is a serpent that is entwined around that staff that he carries. So the statues that you'll see of him are like that. The God of healing. He had a healing center at Pergamum, which is mentioned in the book of Revelation, and that was there from the 4th century BC. You might be interested in just a few things about that. Also, that's the place where Galen, one of the well-known physicians of the time, worked in the 2nd century AD. Not as early as Asclepius, but he went there. And just a few photographs of the place. This is the entry, the street is the entry to the Asclepium. If you ever take a tour that covers the 7 churches of the book of Revelation, you will go to Pergamum. And you will first go, perhaps, to the Asclepium when you are there. And you can have the street here that leads to that. But on the hill you see in the distance, that is Pergamum. That's the site of Pergamum. That's the tell. It's actually first a mountain and then a tell on which the city is built. So here, as you enter the site of the Asclepium, you will have a little statue like this, which is broken now, but you can see what is on it. It is the serpent. It is the caduceus that he has this wrapped around. And then also over on the upper right side, you will see just a piece of pottery that has at least the beginning of his name on it. Asclepius is there on it. So it's inscribed there, and that is from the temple at Corinth. Corinth had a temple to almost any god you can imagine from the Greco-Roman world. And so this is true with regard to Asclepius. When a person was sick and they needed to be healed, they wanted to be healed, or they were sick and they had recovered, then they would go to the temple. And this is the sort of thing that Paul deals with a great deal, more in Corinthians than anywhere else in the New Testament. And you would present a clay, usually clay, offering, just a piece of pottery. You would present this to the temple in thanks for the healing that you would have. You can see the intestines, you can see the ears, you can see the eye, you can see breast, you can see all sexual organs, and so on in these examples. This is from, I believe this is from the British Museum. They have a collection of these, especially at Corinth, one of the places where you can find all sorts of body parts, because people said, maybe it's a foot, maybe it's an intestine, maybe it's the heart. The person says, I'm thankful that I was healed, or I want to be healed. So here's internal organs that you find sometimes. And this word that is used on the drugstores over there, they don't call them the drugstores, they call them the pharmakeo. And the pharmacy, we get pharmacy from that. And that is the word that is used in the New Testament. In Galatians 5 and verse 20, when it is discussing the various works of the flesh. There's flesh and spirit. And so the works of the flesh include this pharmakeo. What is that? Well, it's sorcery. It's the way it's translated. It is translated in some text, some English text, as witchcraft. And the Greek is pharmakeia, or you see the Greek and the English transliteration of that on the sign here. And when you see the drugstore, you will see the insignia over here of Asclepius. See that? And that will be on the drugstore. So originally that meant the misuse of drugs when that term was used. But of course we don't use it that way today. We would have other terminology that we would use. At Laodicea, another one of the churches of the book of Revelation, they had a medical center. They had a noted medical center that emphasized ophthalmology. I know I would have gone. And they dispensed a salve of some sort that was called collyrium. And it was a cosmetic as well as it could be. I mean, you could use it either way, I suppose, or there were two different ways it was made. And Jesus said to these Christians who were here, who thought they could see everything, who thought they were rich, who thought they were powerful, who thought, everything that's big, they thought they could do. And he said to them, buy salve from me, that you may anoint your eyes so that you may see. You're blind, he told them. And so I can give you a little tip on this too, in the book of Revelation, since you're not in Don's class this week. But in the book of Revelation, the 7 churches, in each one of the lessons to the 7 churches, there is something peculiar to it that has to do with its own environment, with its own city. In other words, something that happened there at that place. At Pergamum, he said it's where Satan's throne is. Well, what did that mean? Well, they had all kinds of temples there. They had a temple to the emperor. They had a temple to various gods, and this would be the thing that he's talking about. In other words, these serve the devil. This is what they're doing, rather than serving God. And at Laodicea, you have specific references to the kind of healing that they did at that place. Buy the salve from me, and you'll be able to see. They couldn't see with this salve. It might work, might not work physically, but they needed what he had to provide. There's also at the city these are the ruins of a gymnasium there at the city. They put a lot of emphasis on this sort of thing. They had their water coming from another source, and it came here to this place, the first place it arrived at in the city of Laodicea. It was on a hill to the south of the city. It was not Hierapolis, as a lot of people say, but it was on a hill to the south. And I've walked up on the hill, and I've walked along and seen the whole thing, so I know and understand it. It had large blocks like so, about like this, and then holes in them. And the water came from there. The water was warm when it left, or it was hot when it left the spring. Now, it's true that on the other side of the city, at Hierapolis, they also had hot springs, but that's not where this water came from. It came from the south. So the water came, and it came down the hill, but it was higher than the city. And so it came up here and came to this gymnasium. In other words, an emphasis on health and training and so on that the people would be involved in. Looking further then, in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 5, what kind of diseases did we see in New Testament times during the ministry of Jesus? Well, there's a discussion of what has happened. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. So we have the sicknesses, the diseases, and also we have the death. And that's the main thing, of course, was this one who came healing, this one who came providing something to show the power that he had and who he was. He, of course, could preach that which would save them, and he could raise from the dead. Common diseases also included this reference in Matthew 15, verse 30. It says, "And the great multitudes came to him, and bringing with them those who were lame, crippled, blind, mute, and many others. And they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them." And of course, there are specific references throughout the Gospels to different individuals who are healed by Jesus as he goes about his ministry. Care was evidently very expensive, as it is today. In Mark chapter 5, verse 25, the woman who had the hemorrhage for 12 years, the Bible says that she had endured much at the hands of many physicians. I'm sure some of you feel that way about your care. And I'm thankful for the care that we get, but sometimes it's maybe not the best. Maybe we think it's not the best. And so that could happen back then too. And she had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. So it's really, really bad when you keep going to the doctor, to the medical facilities, and you feel like you're getting worse rather than better. And it happened in New Testament times as well. What would be in a first aid kit if you were traveling? Like you went through the wilderness of Judea. Now, we've talked about this before. If any of you missed the lessons about the wilderness of Judea, it's just an area between the Mount of Olives, on the east side of Jerusalem, all the way down to the Dead Sea and the Transjordan Plateau. And so it's just as dry as can be for the most part. There might be 2 inches of rain at Jericho in a year. And so it's not going to be looking much better than that, except right after the winter rains. It will have a nice green velvety look on it, which I showed you some pictures of that. So the Samaritan man was traveling on the way from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And what happened? Well, there was a man who had fallen among thieves. And so it says that this man bandaged his wounds. He had some bandages with him he carried. He was pouring oil and wine on them. He would have the oil, which could be used for cooking and could also be used for medication. And also he had the wine, which was a daily drink, and he would pour that on them as well. So this is the possibility. Now, way back I told you about somebody I knew who had fallen among thieves in the wilderness of Judea. And who was that? Someone said, I didn't have him in class. It was Phil Roberts. How many remember Phil Roberts? Oh, very good. So Phil was in Israel with his parents. He wanted to take them to Israel. He had worked at archaeological digs, and he wanted to be there with them and show them the country. So he was doing that, and they got ready to go from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and that means traveling through the wilderness of Judea. In order to do that, when you start to do that, you always think, well, I'll stop here and take a look at this place and this place and this place. So he pulled off the road at a certain place, and there are places like their old monasteries. St. George Monastery, for example, is one of them. And you pull off there and you're on the old road. I mean, it is the original road that came from Jericho up to Jerusalem. I told you that it takes, you may remember how long it takes to walk from Jericho to Jerusalem. People who are accustomed to walking, 7 hours minimum. 7 hours time it takes them to do that. So they're there, and they leave their car. And they leave their car unlocked. Yes. And big mistake. But you don't see anybody. There's nobody around. But I'll tell you, if a busload of tourists comes along, you may not see anybody until suddenly there are, how many you got on the tour? 40? There are at least 32 salesmen, boys from this age to this age, and they're ready to sell you the goods that they have, whatever it happens to be. So somebody's a thief because they got things out of his car, took things while they were out walking around, not far away, just a short distance away. So now you know that it really happens in our time that people walking through the wilderness of Judea fall among thieves. It happened to Phil and his parents. Well, sickness in New Testament times. Is that the one I had? No, this is Galatians 4, verse 13. It was because Paul said, of a bodily illness that I preached to you the gospel the first time. So here he is acknowledging, I have a problem. Now, I don't think that's to be connected to his discussion when he talks about a thorn in the flesh. I personally think that was somebody and not some sickness. But maybe you think otherwise. And so he says, it was because of a bodily illness that I preached the gospel to you the first time. In other words, that's why he went into that region. It may mean I went that region rather than going somewhere else because I wasn't able to go somewhere else. And so I went this place. I don't know what it means, actually. And then he also mentions 2 Timothy 4 and verse 20, where he says, Trophimus I left sick at Miletus. So even in the days of the miracles, when the apostles could perform miracles, they did not do that for personal advantage to themselves and their team of people that went with them. And so they had sickness, and they had to endure it just like everybody else. Well, you need to watch what you eat. The diet of the ancient Egyptian included bread that was made from the emmer barley. We said the barley was used more by poor people. It would be coarser than wheat, and also there would be more pieces of the chaff that would be caught up in it and sold at the grocery and the convenience store at the, I wonder what they called it. I'm afraid to say 7-Eleven, so what could I call it? The what? Ponderia? Ponderia. Yeah, the pan. Could call it that. I never understood why they call something Panera bread. That's like talking about a live, what? Like a human man. So, pizza pie. It's a shape, Roland. Your wife can tell you that. So, anyway, look what they had. They had this bread that was made from this barley that they had. They had fruits and vegetables and fish. That's what they had. Now, look what that does to your teeth. So, the teeth show wear from contamination in foods, wind-blown sand, and hard particles. So, especially in Egypt, where you've got the sand that is so bad and it's blown across the Sahara, and there you are getting it in your mouth all the time. We think the pollens are bad, but that would even be worse, wouldn't it? And so this is actually true, that it is a bad thing. We have a famous person in the New Testament called Luke, the physician. Luke the physician. And so Luke travels along with the Apostle Paul, and it says he's the beloved physician, in Colossians 4, verse 14, and he sent greetings to the people. It's like he became Paul's personal physician and stayed with him a great deal of time. In fact, in 2 Timothy 4:11, it says, Only Luke is with me. But what a comfort that would be to the Apostle Paul. Luke is with me. And he was very thankful for that, by the way he expresses it. There was a book written a number of years ago, and I'm rather confident, I've not studied this beyond this point, but I'm rather confident that this list would be changed. Some of these things might be taken off, and there might be others that were added. But Hobart said that there were 480 contemporary medical terms in Luke and Acts, the books written by Luke. So think about that for a moment. Now in Luke 4:38, the expression that is translated in our versions, great fever, this person had a great fever, that was one of those expressions. In other words, it was a technical medical term in those days. And so it's describing actual illnesses that people had. And then in Luke 5 in verse 12, when it says about the person, he was full of leprosy. Full of leprosy. Now I'm trying to avoid giving time for anybody to ask me what was leprosy. But it was, you know, a terrible disease. We have something that people call leprosy, Hansen's disease. Now in India specifically is where you see it a lot. Maybe other places as well. That's where I've seen it. And the point is simply that that was, in those days, a skin condition that you just had no cure for, except Jesus. And he could cure the people, and he did. And that's like the story where he said he healed 10 lepers, and only one turned back to thank him. And what was his statement about that? Where are the 9? Yes, people ungrateful. Here's some surgical instruments from the British Museum. I look at that picture and it reminds me of when I was a kid. And we had to go into Huntsville from Harvest. It's a long way back then. It was 16 miles. And we had to go into town to go to the doctor. Or I remember one time being sick and the doctor came a distance of 16 miles in the night in order to see me. My dad had to go to another home to use the phone to get a call in. There was no electricity, of course. We had one Aladdin lamp and several coal oil lamps in the house. A lot of people here old enough to remember that. Think about that. So, but we'd go in, my mother took me to the doctor there, and I sat there in that office, and I was frightened to death. You know why? He had a glass case there, and he had stuff like that in it. Some of it looked like ice tongs, and I knew he was going to try them out before I left the office. So it really scared me. But they had things like that too. You see, whatever they are and whatever purpose they might serve. So here are some bronze forceps that were used in those days. Take something out of you. You got a bad place there. You got some swelling there. I think I can get that. He pulls it out. So whatever, that's the way they did it in the 1st and 2nd century. There's mention of the midwives in Egypt. In Exodus 1 and verse 20 it says that God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. So the Israelites multiplied because the midwives were helping the ladies. And I saw this during a Nile cruise. This is a place called Kum Umbo in Egypt, and it shows a woman on a birthing stool. I hope this is not inappropriate tonight, but there she is seated in the proper position to give birth. So that's what they called to that and what they referred to it. And the midwife would no doubt be there as well to assist her. Embalming was used. The physicians embalmed Israel. Jacob was embalmed. And not only that, but Joseph was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. And do you remember what he told his family? I want you to do what? Take my body to the land that God promised. So when you go, what a great sermon that is. When you go to the promised land, and that God has promised to us, then I want you to remember to take my bones with you. So that's a way we say, take my skin, take my bones, take my hands. We talk about hands. How many hands do you have? We mean how many workers you have. And then we always divide it by 2. So we talk about the number of people that we're dealing with. And that's what you have there. King Tut, this is in the Egyptian Museum as well. I keep wondering when the new Egyptian Museum is going to open. It was not open. Leon took a group not long ago, and it was not open at that time. So hopefully very soon, they've been doing this for years and years now, that it'll be open next year. But in the old museum, they had this little container made of alabaster, and then here are 4 little canopic jars. And these jars contained what was taken out of the body in the embalming process. So here's a list. I think I have a list for you. These were what was put in those: the lungs in one of them, the liver in another, the intestines, and the stomach. I'm assuming that they thought these would be useful to the king or to whoever it was in another life, because they also put, the things they would need, and the tomb paintings are just fabulous, and they usually show people who are there to serve the king. They're there to provide him water, to go make crops for him, everything he needs in this afterlife. So the canopic jars, you see those somewhere in the museum, that's what they are. And whether there's still stuff in them, I don't know about that. I didn't look. It's actually behind the glass. And then, so this is the way that the mummies are prepared, and this is the way that Joseph would have been prepared if he indeed was embalmed, and that's what the scripture says happened to him. They had, if you had a funeral there, they had the boat that would go on the Nile and would carry the body from wherever the person was to another place for the burial. And these are beautiful little examples. They're all small. You've seen them in numerous museums, perhaps. You can see these in the British Museum. You can see them in probably the Metropolitan, and maybe especially the Brooklyn Museum. If you ever go to New York, go to the Metropolitan Museum, but also just take the subway and you can get off right in front of the Brooklyn Museum. And they have a big collection of Assyrian reliefs, not reliefs only, but of statues and reliefs. And they also have a large room, I believe actually 2, that are devoted to Egypt. So they have a lot of good things that will help you understand what life was like in those days in Bible times. University of Chicago, go there. And if you're in Chicago, don't just go shopping. Don't just take the mile, but go a few miles away and go to this museum, the Oriental Institute, and there you can see lots of things that come from specific Bible places. Megiddo, for example, there's a section from Egypt, a section from Persia, and so on. So they're very, very nice. Here's some of the ways that burial took place in Bible times. This first one I'm going to show you, I've told you already, it's rated V for vividness, right? You don't have to look at it. That's the way to get them to look. On TV, when they say, this may be offensive to some people, Hey, Mom. Everybody wants to be sure to see it and not miss it. We'll record it in case we do. So, what do we have here? Well, this is Canaanite period at Jericho. There is a skeleton of the last person to die in the front, that is near the entry. So the person is left there for their bones, for their body to rot away, and for the bones to be there. They have pottery. This is true throughout Bible times. They would have pottery, whether it's in Egypt or in Israel or wherever. They'd have pottery buried with the person, containing something that that person might need. The concept that the person will need these items in the afterlife, and so on. And so the bones will be there, scattered around the tomb. Pottery is there, and this is a British Museum exhibit, and it is indeed rated for vividness. So what you see is that in the foreground here is the skeleton of Uncle John. And then in the back of that, where you see the large jars, those are the bones of those who have already preceded him in death. So you've got everybody there. So in this method, that was this practice that was common and was found at Jericho, in this practice you see the last person is the one who is there at the first. So here's the way it looks when you go to visit the cemetery. Jacob said, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. What cave was that? The cave of Machpelah. And so here you have these people that are going to be buried there. They want to go there, be buried there, because Abraham is there. And then, of course, Isaac and Jacob, their wives, all these people are buried in this place. Now, it was a cave. Abraham bought a cave from Ephron the Hittite. And I showed you a picture, didn't I? I thought I did, from the actual ancient tale of what we would call, not Beersheba, what are we talking about? Hebron. And you would have this place there, but you look down on it and you can see down there's the building. And this was so certain, this place was so certain, that when Herod the Great started his building program, he didn't just build the temple. He built things all over the country. And so there he built this tremendous building that still stands and has the typical Herodian stone. If it had been a temple to God, the Romans might have destroyed it too. But it was simply a building that was held a cemetery. And so when you visit it today, if you have the opportunity to do so, you will see places where you can look down into the cave, but you see nothing, of course. And there's a story that is told about the daughter of, who was the guy that had the one bad eye? The Israeli commander, Moshe Dayan. Yeah, when Moshe Dayan, his daughter, the story goes, it's been told in print, and she was very thin, very small, maybe 12, 14 years old, and they let her down through this opening so that she could see what was down there, and of course she didn't report anything. There was nothing to be seen, because after all these years, there was simply nothing that was left from 3,000, 4,000 years ago. But nonetheless, that is the place, and that's where Jacob wanted to be. He wanted to be there, buried in the family cemetery. Not uncommon, is it? That's a very nice thing to think about. Now here's another kind of tomb. This one is at the place called Bab-edh-Drah. Bab-edh-Drah is on the south end of the Dead Sea, over on the Jordan side. So if you're in Jordan, you can go to this, and you can't go to it from the Israeli side unless you make a crossing over there. And what you're looking at here is this, that you have, let me try to get the picture. Here's the opening up at the top. See that? See the light coming in? And then when you get down here to the bottom, what do you see? You see some pottery, you see bones, and so on. And so it's sort of like taking a jar that is larger at the bottom than it is at the top and putting it in the earth. Only in this case it's dug out. So it's called a shaft tomb. And this is at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. If you ever go there, be sure to go to this museum. It's a great museum, one that would be very helpful to you in understanding a lot of things. They have some older manuscripts of the Bible as well, in addition to all the things from various countries. This is looking at the bottom of this tomb. It's a photograph they have there, actually an exhibit. They have an exhibit, and then I made the photograph. So you can see pottery that was in the tomb, and so on, and some of the bones that are left there. There is a type of burial among the Philistines. You remember they were on the southern Mediterranean coast of what we think of as Israel today. It's roughly where Gaza Strip is today. And they had these burial coffins. They're called anthropoid because they're made in the shape of a person, the shape of a man. And you can see in the one on the right here from the Amman Museum in Jordan that there are some pieces that are missing, and they have been filled in with the white. So that's what they do with pottery, that they have a portion missing out of a piece of pottery. They will fill it in. They don't try to make it look like the other because they don't want you to think that they had the whole thing. They let you see what they found and what they didn't find. And then from the British Museum, there is the picture of one of these. But I've got a better example of these. In the Israel Museum, when you enter the area for archaeology in the museum, this is what you will see first, unless they move it, put something else there. But it is the place is called, look on the left, Deir el-Balah. I met the man who made photographs for archaeologists a lot. In fact, he made pictures for me. And we used those before we had a collection of photographs, because when we were still in the days of slides, it was more difficult. You had to have the projector and you showed a few slides, of something. But in order to be able to have aerial pictures, you'd have to take a flight. It was thought in those days you'd have to have the helicopter. And a helicopter, for the period of time that you would need to make a couple of thousand pictures, would cost you about $2,200. Very expensive. You could do the same thing by plane now for maybe $400 or $500. And I've done it by plane 2 or 3 times, I believe. But these were found in the sand. And so you can see the opening so that a body went into each one of these. This gentleman, who has Zev Radovan is his name, German background, and his name will appear in many books that you have, if they're older books especially. If there's a picture of something from the Bible land, it will have under it Zev Radovin. And so he was a good photographer and got permissions in the museums, in order to do that. And he told me that when he went and photographed this dig, that was the most exciting thing he had ever done. That to begin to see these faces staring up as they uncovered them one by one. So that as soon as he learned about it, they called him. And he went to the site. And he was there making the pictures for the entire time. So that's a very interesting thing and a kind of a personal touch for me to see that. So here's just the head of one, the top of it. And that's where they would open to slide the body into it, I suppose. And I'm going to talk about the tomb next Sunday. And we're going to talk about the tomb of Jesus. We're going to talk about the Holy Sepulchre. We're going to talk about the garden tomb, in case you've heard of both of those. And there are several things about the tomb of Jesus that we read. That it was a new tomb. It was a rock tomb cut out of solid rock. It was sealed, and after they went into it, they surveyed it. They found the linen cloths rolled up and put in a place by themselves. The wrappings from around the body, another place. So they saw all of this in the position where it should have been. And those of you who had my evidence classes, how many had evidences? Oh, look at that. That's wonderful. Well, there's the new book. It was published about a year ago, and there are 14 pages in the book dealing specifically with the subject of the resurrection of Jesus. So I recommend that book to you. How many of you recommend it? Huh? It's a good thing. It's a wonderful book, and it's a lot more than that. No, it's available at the Florida College bookstore. Yeah, I tried it out on the students first, and then all of them lived, and so we put it in print. Well, this is where we'll start. We'll talk about burial in first century Palestine, and we'll explain why the tombs were like they were and what was involved in burying someone at that time, including people like Lazarus and people like Jesus. The burial was the same. It was the resurrection that was different in both of those cases. So we've got a few minutes. Anybody have a question? We've got 4 or 5 minutes, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question, and it's possible. In fact, I've seen places where they have a rod in southern Israel is one of them, where they'll have this big shaft that's like a pole actually, with the serpent wrapped around it, and it looks almost the same. I do not know, but I think that's a good possibility. Good possibility. There may be people who take a position for sure that it is. Is that our bell, Joe? Okay, good deal. See all of you next Sunday, Lord willing. Yeah. Thank you, brother. I appreciate your help.
You bet. Appreciate you. Good class.
Better cut this off.
We're learning things.
Oh, wonderful.
Right, Susan?